You should have a pop up there. Oh, there we go. I can see your screen now.
Okay, should I minimize my controls?
No, we cannot see those. We just see your slides.
Okay, great. So good afternoon, everyone. Our time together today will be divided really into two parts. First, we'll set the stage with a big picture overview of privacy in the library, including a quick overview of the ethics, standards, and laws that define librarians' responsibility to protect patron privacy. And then we'll discuss how the digital revolution in libraries now requires libraries to carefully rethink how they protect patron privacy. Then Michael will take over and discuss how to do practical privacy in the library, the nuts and bolts of actually implementing security controls and procedures and policies that will protect online and digital privacy in the library. And as Louise mentioned, we'll offer several opportunities throughout the presentation to ask questions and to take your comments. Now, to begin, we all understand that privacy is one of the core tenets of librarianship. But what are we talking about when we talk about privacy in the library? Now, there are many and varied definitions of privacy, but in the library, we're concerned about intellectual privacy, the kind of privacy that protects our ability to keep our reading habits and our intellectual activities confidential. Intellectual privacy protects our ability to read what we want and think for ourselves without worrying that other people might judge us based on the books that we've read or the ideas we've considered. Intellectual privacy allows us to explore those ideas and opinions and beliefs others might not approve of and figure out for ourselves what our values are in regards to politics, sexuality, and morality. And privacy creates boundaries between the individual and society, thereby allowing for greater tolerance and protection for the freedom of conscience. In simpler terms, intellectual privacy is providing protection from surveillance or interference whenever we read, think, or consult with those we trust. By fostering an environment respectful of intellectual privacy, libraries provide a safe space for all three activities. Now, needless to say, intellectual privacy is essential to protecting intellectual freedom in the library. The freedom to read and receive information in the library cannot exist when a person's library use is monitored and their individual reading habits are made known to the public. By allowing library users to select, access, and use information without fear of embarrassment, judgment, punishment, or ostracism, the library enables its patrons to fully realize their freedom to read, to explore unorthodox ideas, weigh arguments, and fulfill their individual desires and needs. In library land, we call this the right to open inquiry without having the subject of one's interest examined or scrutinized by others. And by others, we've usually meant the government, but it can also include like family members, teachers, administrators, other members of the community. Now, if you doubt if there's any consequences when a patron's reading habits are made public, consider the case of this graduate student accused of terrorism simply because he was seen reading a book on terrorism studies, a book he was required to read for his graduate studies at his university. Reading about certain ideas at the wrong time has consequences, has had consequences, up to and including public suspicion or arrest or imprisonment. In the 1970s, for example, U.S. Treasury officials approached public libraries in Atlanta, Cleveland, Milwaukee, and elsewhere, and started to ask to see the circulation records for books on bomb making, guerrilla warfare, and other subjects considered dangerous by government authorities. In other instances, prosecutors in Iowa demanded to see who had been reading books on witchcraft in an attempt to find out who had been drawing occult symbols on cows. And a Texas prosecutor demanded to know who had borrowed books on childbirth after an infant was abandoned on the steps of a local hospital. In more recent years, internet use records and browsing histories have similarly been targeted by the authorities. But if a person fears that their activity in the library is being monitored or shared with the public, or that it may be subject to government scrutiny, it's all but certain that that person will limit what they do there, avoiding certain books or websites, maybe even stop using the library at all. And so because of this, because of the possibility that a person's freedom of inquiry will be inhibited, library professionals are committed to preserving the freedom to read without interference and without surveillance. Through the American Library Association and the International Federation of Library Associations, library professionals have developed standards for professional conduct that govern how librarians and libraries provide services to library patrons. These standards express the rights of library users to intellectual freedom and privacy, and express the expectations that the profession places on libraries to support these rights. The first of these are the professionals. At least since 1939, librarians have acknowledged that privacy is a necessary and vital component of intellectual freedom. The professional commitment to patron privacy is expressed within ALA's Code of Ethics, which mandates that librarians protect each library user's right to privacy and confidentiality with respect to the information sought or received and the resources consulted, borrowed, or acquired. The IFLA Code of Ethics similarly identifies respect for personal privacy, protection of personal data, and confidentiality in the relationship between the user between the user and the library. These codes create a professional, ethical obligation on the part of librarians and information workers alike to protect patrons' right to privacy and confidentiality. This requires them to not disclose a user's information without the user's consent. The librarian's professional position of trust with regard to users' confidential information can be directly compared to the duty of confidentiality held by other professions toward their clients, for example, doctors, clergy, and lawyers. Thus, no one who works in the library should share personally identifiable user information or information about a user's use of library resources with any other third party, unless that patron gives permission for the library to do so. Now, as affirmed in the ALA's privacy interpretation of the Library Bill of Rights, library users enjoy the right to read and inquire free from any monitoring or scrutiny, and can expect that the library will keep its information confidential. IFLA similarly affirms the library user's right to privacy and anonymity, and that their use of library materials will remain confidential. Both documents are intended to inform libraries and the larger public about expectations that the library profession places on libraries to support a library's user's right to intellectual freedom and privacy. They establish a professional standard to both measure and define the library's policies and practices in regards to user privacy. Now, both the Library Bill of Rights and the Code of Ethics draw upon the First Amendment right to read and receive information anonymously. That is, the proposition that a person has a right to keep their intellectual activity private. Courts have, in fact, explicitly recognized a personal First Amendment right to keep one's reading habits private, and have extended the Fourth Amendment right to be free from unreasonable government searches and seizures from the individual's home to other contexts, including the public library. This body of court opinions relies upon a series of Supreme Court decisions that argue that the Constitution protects a zone of privacy that safeguards individual privacy and autonomy, including the right to avoid disclosure of personal matters, a right that the Supreme Court describes as the constitutional right to information privacy. As explained by the Supreme Court, the First Amendment protects the privacy of a person's reading habits, associations, and communications as an additional right necessary to give full meaning to the First Amendment's enumerated rights of speech, press, belief, and assembly. Of course, these rights are not absolute. The court's support for the For laws like the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, the amended USA Freedom Act, which is the successor to the Patriot Act, all demonstrate that the government interests like national security or criminal investigations can trump individual privacy rights. Even so, based on the inherent importance of individuals' right to be free from government inquiry that might chill their exercise of First Amendment rights, courts have required the government to demonstrate both probable cause and a particularized need for information about a person's reading habits before allowing prosecutors access to that information. More succinctly, courts will require law enforcement or other third parties to obtain a court order or a subpoena in order to obtain or examine a person's library records or information. Now, in addition to the more general privacy protections offered by the Supreme Court and other court decisions, there are state laws that provide more specific protections to library users' information. In 48 states and the District of Columbia, circulation records and records containing library users' personal information are confidential and are exempt from disclosure to third parties. Many states actually forbid the disclosure of library records to third parties unless the library is presented with a valid court order authorizing the release of that information. Now, the two states that don't have library confidentiality laws have instead Attorney General's opinions that protect the confidentiality of library records. Now, in addition to library confidentiality laws, a few states have actually begun to adopt laws that protect a broad right to reader privacy that extends beyond libraries to booksellers, electronic content providers, and video stores. And finally, state open records laws and local ordinances addressing open records and records management, and even state Freedom of Information Acts may also regulate the management of library records and impose particular data management and record retention requirements on publicly funded libraries. Now, Illinois' library confidentiality statute forbids libraries from disclosing circulation or registration records unless the library is presented with a court order. The law reflects a traditional view of library privacy, the need to prevent a government agency from viewing patron reading records. And most ALA policies addressing library users' privacy, all promulgated many years ago, are similarly targeted at this specific threat. The threat that a police officer or an FBI agent will show up at the library circulation desk with a demand to see patron records. But this concept of library privacy that's reflected in the Illinois statute looks to a time when the library was the sole institution creating, storing, and handling patron records. Patrons would go to the desk to check out a book or ask a reference question and give the librarian a very limited set of information in order to do these things. Then the librarian or the library staffer created a record of that transaction and stored it in the records system, first as a paper record and then eventually as an electronic data file stored on a computer unconnected to the internet. Library catalogs were by definition anonymous. Patrons could look up an item and walk away without identifying themselves, leaving no record of their inquiry because none was created. So library privacy was a simple task: prevent unauthorized third parties, primarily law enforcement, from viewing or using a patron circulation record. But libraries are changed institutions. They provide patrons with access to the internet and to all kinds of digital content and services, including ebooks, databases, online reference, and streaming films, video, and music. They're no longer closed systems. What had formerly been contained within the physical walls of a library is now scattered across cyberspace. Offering computer labs and open wireless internet access allows for the potential of library patrons' information to be viewed or their browsing habits to be watched. At the same time, libraries want to provide the best content and services in a digital delivery format that their community desires. But as libraries move to providing collections and services in a digital format, they are opening themselves and their patrons up to the tracking of research and reading habits. These trends, the digitization of the library's catalog, circulation, and other information systems, and the delivery of digital content from third-party services, and the transformation of the library into a site for public internet access, make protecting patron privacy a challenge. While there is much more awareness in the library world about privacy and surveillance concerns, library policies and practices simply haven't caught up with how the new technologies are collecting, storing, and using patron data. This leaves libraries having to make compromises on patron privacy, e-content, and digital services. In addition, we have a host of outside third-party vendors who provide integrated library services, online public catalogs, ebooks, and other digital content, and even hosted software as a service solutions that deliver integrated social discovery experiences to library users. Use of these services requires the patron to share their personal information, not only with the library, but with these vendors chosen by the library, generating a tremendous amount of data about a patron's intellectual activities and use of these outside library resources, all of which can be tied back to that particular user. Many of these platforms are based on, and indeed built upon, encouraging increased information flows and the tracking, capturing, and aggregating of data about users' activities. Now, this isn't to suggest that third-party services are evil or malign, but to simply point out that they are commercial for-profit entities that operate in a business environment that views data as a valuable commodity. Librarian Trina Maggi spent some time doing a comprehensive review of the privacy notices and policies provided by commercial library vendors and concluded that vendors do not share librarians' ethical commitment to preserving user privacy. Though the vendors largely met commercial industry standards for such factors as notice, consent, and data protection, they failed to meet the heightened standards of privacy established by American libraries. And additionally, vendors are not required to follow state library confidentiality laws that mandate the protection of library users' data. Without those legal limits, vendors are free to use and share whatever data comes into their control. But the nub of the issue is what happens to the patron's data. Before online services, libraries kept it locked up in library drawers or stored on library servers. Now patron data is shared with a third party, circulated over the internet, and may not even be controlled or managed by the library. So information about a patron's intellectual activities could be leaked or disclosed. Now, we've already seen some examples of this happen in the realm of patron privacy. In 2014, a software engineer who happened actually to be a spouse of a librarian discovered by chance that the Adobe Digital Editions ebook platform was gathering data on what ebooks were opened by a reader, what pages are read, and in what order those pages were read. The platform then sent this data back to Adobe Adobe servers in clear text, accompanied by the user's identity and the title, publisher, and other metadata associated with each book. This activity took place indiscriminately on all Adobe ebook platforms, including those hosting library-provided ebooks. The lack of encryption meant that anyone could monitor that data stream and spy on the user's reading habits in real time. And if that data was stored on Adobe servers and associated with a particular user, it would create a record that could be discovered and disclosed in the future. While Adobe took immediate steps to encrypt its data flows and limited the collection of metadata to ebooks with digital rights management software, it illustrates how vendors can be careless with patron data and why libraries need to monitor and validate how patron data is being used. Now, another trend we see is the practice of embedding social media links in online catalogs and library websites. But an embedded Facebook liked button is like a superpowered tracking cookie. It will keep a record of every page visited by a unique user and follow that user as they browse the internet. So when libraries blend services from external social media and e-commerce networks into their own web pages, it's all but certain that data about the user's use of the OPAC and the library's website will be tracked and transmitted to external networks. And another emerging challenge to patron privacy is the library's own collection, use, and analysis of patron data. Libraries' technical capabilities to collect and analyze usage data have expanded rapidly with the new digital systems, but these abilities have sometimes seemed to outpace the ethical conversations surrounding this type of data collection and use. ALA has long advised librarians to only collect what patron information is necessary to achieve the mission of the library and avoid retaining that information once it's served its purpose. There are really good reasons behind this advice because it reduces the risk that a patron's borrowing activities will be revealed to others or be subject to government surveillance. But the same code of ethics that urges librarians to protect patron privacy also obligates librarians to provide the highest level of service to all library users through appropriate and usefully organized resources, an obligation that is aided by the analysis of library patron data. So many libraries are making use of the rich trove of digital data generated by patron transactions to improve their patron services on the grounds that determining patrons' needs and wants from the transaction data generated in the library is an essential part of the library's mission. But one has to ask, how far do we go with collecting and using patron data? There are now tools that will match a patron's address to consumer data profiles generated by credit bureaus for the purposes of analyzing and marketing the library. Collecting user data for marketing and analysis purposes rather than for improving the library services or delivering library services to patrons represents a real shift in many library stances toward user privacy and data management. But those who do use these tools believe that they are necessary for promoting libraries and providing improved library services. So they urge libraries to rethink privacy and rely on responsible data security measures to preserve patron privacy, rather than simply discarding useful data and locking up that data within the library. But to do this requires the library profession to expand its responsibilities and its thinking concerning patron privacy and confidentiality. Libraries and librarians should not only keep information private on library users' behalf, we should also provide them with sufficient information and access so that they can exercise meaningful control over their information. If we mean what we say about defending patron privacy, we must not only keep it safe from disclosure, but also let patrons choose what happens to their data. Alan Weston, who was a very forward-looking legal scholar, proposed this new, more modern conception of privacy just as government agencies were bringing the first central data banks online in the mid-1960s. He believed that freedom only exists when you can control who watches you or control who learns information about you. Consequently, he described the right to privacy as the right to determine how much of your personal information is disclosed, to whom it is disclosed, and how it is maintained. In line with this concept of privacy, there is a host of new privacy law and regulations that are being adopted by Congress and the states. These laws, often called sector-specific privacy laws, are meant to address specific and identified privacy harms, as well as give individuals more control of over their privacy. The Video Privacy Protection Act, for example, forbids disclosure of personally identifiable loan or rental records for pre-recorded videocassette tapes or other audiovisual materials. The Child Online Privacy Protection Act, COPPA, requires websites and web-based services to obtain a parent's written consent before collecting data from children under the age of 13. A large number of states have also adopted student data privacy laws that strongly regulate institutions' use of students' personal electronic data. Laws like California's Student Online Privacy Protection Act, or SOPIPA. Other data privacy laws regulate the use of biometric identifiers, location information, and internet service providers' collection and use of customer data. And many states have adopted laws that require a company, agency, or other organization to immediately notify individuals when their personal data has been compromised in a data breach. So if we incorporate Weston's ideas and the philosophy expressed by these new laws into our own practice of privacy and confidentiality, library privacy would mean more than simply keeping records private and protecting records from government surveillance. It would also require the enforcement of legal, social, and ethical limitations on the use and treatment of patron information, and enforcing each patron's right to control her information, including the right to make choices about who has it and what they can do with it. It also means that libraries should not only keep information private on a patron's behalf, but libraries also provide patrons with sufficient information and access so they can exercise meaningful control over their information about their library use. And finally, it would require libraries to employ robust encryption and cybersecurity measures to protect against the unauthorized disclosure of patron data. Now, I can offer you 5 practical steps to take to protect patrons' online privacy to achieve this goal of better online privacy. First, update your library's policies and procedures to ensure that they address patron privacy needs and that they assure the security of all the data that flows to the library's servers. Things to do are to apply and adopt new standards like the NISO consensus principles on users' digital privacy, as well as the new ALA privacy guidelines and checklists that incorporate fair information practice principles into these checklists and standards. This includes providing robust support for informed consent, that is, providing users with all the available information about a platform or service's use, storage, and communication of personal data. This allows the patron to make meaningful choices about what information they want to share and how they want their data treated. Make services that require data opt-in, and when possible, provide access to tools and procedures that allow for anonymous activation and delegated authentication for library services. This anonymous access is especially important given that so many public library patrons have no alternatives to turn to for safe, private access to books, information, and the internet. Political activists, members of the LGBT community, immigrants, domestic abuse victims, persons with sensitive health issues, and students and children who will be tax-paying adults someday, all entrust their personal information and their reading habits with the library. We need to remember this as we make decisions about what to collect, what to retain, and what to share of library users' records and information, and what kind of access we provide to those resources. Finally, another essential policy is a strong records management plan that identifies the types of data kept by the library and establishes procedures for the destruction of the records when the records are no longer needed for the library's use. This includes a regularly scheduled privacy and data collection audit that will look through the library's records, systems, and procedures and allow the library to thoroughly understand what's going on in regards to those systems and processes so that the library can develop new policies and procedures to address identified privacy risks. Second, employ full encryption for library websites, native services, and data storage, opting in for the highest level of security offered by a library vendor. This means encrypting your library's website and online services with HTTPS encryption protocols, and the use of encryption technologies that provide a layer of protection that keeps the records and data secure even when an unauthorized hacker gains access to your networks. By adopting comprehensive encryption strategies, you can close a major privacy vulnerability, especially in regards to your OPACs, content platforms, and discovery services. Third, you should require your third-party vendors to adhere to the same privacy and record retention standards used by the library. When user data is provided to or managed by a vendor providing e-content, cataloging, and data management services to the library, The library should require the vendor to enter into an actual legal agreement that stipulates that the library retains control of its users' data, that the data is confidential, and that it may not be used or shared with other third parties except with the permission of the library. When you're negotiating the contracts for vendor-provided services, the vendor should also be required to encrypt its data flows and to notify the library whenever a data breach occurs. Fourth, you should provide patrons with the means to protect their own privacy whenever they use the library's public access computers. This means going beyond the standard practice of equipping workstations with software that automatically clears cookies and browser histories and erases personal files or information left behind by the user. Make robust encryption tools available to patrons who are engaging in personalized online transactions or communications, like HTTPS Everywhere, a free browser extension that encrypts all web communications from within the browser and automatically redirects the user to the most secure version of a website. Finally, develop a program of ongoing privacy education and training, both for staff and for library users alike. Patron privacy isn't just a function of policies, vendor negotiations, or network security. It relies on trained and committed staff. So all staff members should be given training opportunities that inform them about the library's policies and procedures in regards to patron privacy, the importance of maintaining patron privacy, and their ethical and legal obligation to protect that privacy. Frontline staff should also have the opportunity to learn about strategies for protecting individual privacy online so that they are able to assist patrons who want help with protecting their privacy. Now, some examples of such programs are available online. For example, the Data Privacy Project, a privacy literacy training program in New York City, has trained more than 600 information and library professionals in the New York metropolitan area. And the San Jose Public Library has created a virtual privacy lab, which is a resource for patrons to generate a custom privacy toolkit for themselves. The toolkit asks questions about their online use and privacy concerns and generates a unique set of strategies for that patron. Now, you might ask how to achieve these 5 steps. And that's what Mike is here for today, to offer those practical strategies for protecting patron privacy. Now, to close, I'd like to recommend a couple of resources that go into far more detail about law, ethics, policy, and practice concerning patron privacy, particularly the new LIDA guide on protecting patron privacy, which offers a wealth of information about privacy. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions you have, and if not, we can start with Mike's presentation.
Thank you, Deborah. I do have a couple comments that came in that are somewhat related, so I'll read both of them to you and you can address them if you'd like. So one person commented that the local police are upset with her when she does not give them access to video footage without a subpoena. Mm-hmm. And then the related question is that another person said, my understanding is that there is a caveat to the Illinois statute that allows law enforcement to request information from a library if they can prove imminent threat of harm. I don't know if you'd like to address those questions.
Okay, let me take the second question first, or the second comment first, and that's absolutely correct. The Illinois law does include an exception for what's called exigent circumstances, and let me spell that since my pronunciation isn't clear. That's E-X-I-G-E-N-T, which actually is just a fancy legal way of saying emergency circumstances. There was a concern expressed by law enforcement in the state of Illinois that there might be a circumstance where a library record might be the only way of identifying a victim of a crime. And they sought to change the library confidentiality law to allow police to fully access library records. A compromise was reached so that in emergency circumstances, when the law enforcement officer submits a written affidavit that someone's life is in danger or there's a specific threat to property, they can ask for a patron's record or for information about a patron in order to address that emergency situation. The law specifically bars the library from disclosing anything more than the name and personally identifiable information about the library user. It cannot disclose information about their use of library resources. In regards to video surveillance footage, many libraries have resorted to the use of surveillance cameras to increase the library security. And while it's not an ideal solution, it's one we recognize that libraries often find they must use with limited staffing and limited resources. And what we advise in those circumstances is that, first of all, make sure that the cameras are recording as little of intellectual activity as possible. For example, don't point the camera so it records what's going on persons' computer screens, so that you're not making a record of their recording of their browsing history. Or don't point the camera directly over a checkout desk so you can that you're recording what books an individual are checking out. In that regard, library surveillance footage then can be used to help solve crimes without disclosing patron information. If a camera does record protected activity like web browsing or what books are being read by a user, it really should be treated in the same way as any other library record that contains information about a user's intellectual activities. And so in that case, it's absolutely correct to require a subpoena to get at those records. And in fact, it's just a good idea from a legal standpoint, because when a court order is obtained, that protects the process. It allows that information to be used in evidence in court. And if it's obtained in an illegitimate fashion, it could be excluded from evidence. So in many ways, asking the police to comply with the law is a way of preserving the legal justice process, and is in fact a best practice.
Okay. Great, thank you, Deborah. I just want to mention you had shared the Data Privacy Project and the San Jose Public Library's Virtual Privacy Lab. I put links to those into the chat, so if anybody needed links to those, you'll find them there. And I think with that, we'll go ahead and move on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Good morning or good afternoon. Deborah has agreed. Deborah is actually controlling it. This is her desktop we're looking at, so you'll hear me saying next slide as we go through this. And I thank Deborah for agreeing to manage that for me. What I'm hoping to do is cover a number of kind of interrelated areas that are very practical ways you can tackle some of the privacy issues. I think the 5 steps Deborah outlined, I think, are very good, but they can also be overwhelming. When I've worked in technology and libraries for over 20 years, and I just started getting involved around the privacy stuff about 4 or 5 years ago, and I felt overwhelmed when I looked at once you expand into the online world, the nature of the privacy concerns that libraries find themselves in trying to engage in the modern web and provide services to their patrons that they want, but also kind of preserve traditional library ethics and values around privacy. So sometimes I actually feel like when I go through these resources that I'm going to show you, don't think by any means that my library that I work in is doing all of these things. I often call myself, I'm like a doctor who's telling you not to smoke who smokes. Is how I feel sometimes. But the point is, it's an iterative process to try to improve privacy practices in your library. So I'm hoping to give you some tips around that. I'm trying to focus on these 5 different areas. The first one's going to be around resources that libraries can use, consult to do some of this work. And I will be talking about some of the things Deborah talked about and the library guidelines and checklists, and some areas you can go to find resources on that. Then I'm going to look at 2 guidelines and checklists that were developed by ALA, one around digital content providers and the other around integrated library systems. And we're going to look at both of those in detail about the checklist of steps libraries can take in those areas. And then I'm going to focus on 2 different areas that one is around HTTPS and a certificate authority called Let's Encrypt that provides free HTTPS. So that's the encryption technology that Deborah was talking about, one of the encryption technologies. And then finally, tools to protect web users. And so this is a set of ways web users, when they're browsing the internet, can protect their privacy. And this is both tools that libraries can offer web users when they're in the library using the web, but also just in general things that librarians should be aware of, since we often are the experts of digital literacy and privacy, that we can offer our patrons, even for their use in home or outside the library when they're browsing the web, ways to protect their privacy when they're online. So those are the areas I'm hoping to cover. I'll break for questions in between each one. I think that we're good for the next slide now. Okay, so for library resources, hopefully many of you are aware of the Choose Privacy Week, which is an activity the first week of May, kind of like Banned Books, but around privacy that ALA and the Office of Intellectual Freedom started about 5 or 6 years ago, 7 years ago, that initially it focused on programming that you could do around privacy awareness activities in your libraries to kind of raise awareness around online privacy issues in your libraries. This past year, we redesigned the website and we added a section to focus on resources. And so, and you can see the URL on the screen there. If you go to this part of the Choose Privacy Week website, it's also the resources tab on the top navigation menu. You can see that it's listing a number of resources on this page that libraries can use to engage in improving privacy in their libraries. So you can see a list of pages on here. There's a link to a page on tools to protect user privacy, and actually we'll talk about some of those tools in a later section. The guidelines and checklists for libraries, and we'll talk about those. There's also sample policies and documents. So, we're going to tell you, oh, you should, include privacy in your policy. And it's like, okay, well, how? Well, if you go there, you can see some examples of how libraries have dealt with including privacy policies. HTTP and Let's Encrypt, which we'll talk about. There's also a separate page on resources for students and minors. So everything we talk about in terms of public libraries and privacy becomes even more complicated with students and minors. There's more legal ramifications and there's more technological issues around school libraries and students and minors. There's also a link to presentations and webinars. And so when we do we'll probably put a link to this webinar up there afterwards if that's okay with Louise. We'll put a link up to there. So what we try to do is create kind of a clearinghouse of resources around privacy. We noticed they were spread out in multiple places. And we are trying to make kind of a one-stop shop across some of the silos and different places things can be published in ALA and other places. Okay, next slide. So if off of that page we clicked on the guidelines and checklists for libraries, you'll see a list of the privacy guidelines, and these have been published over the last 3 years. And they were published by the Intellectual Freedom Committee of the American Library Association. And they're really designed to help libraries develop best practices. There had been a privacy toolkit that the Intellectual Freedom Committee had published years ago, but it was like a 60, 70-page document, and it was a bit overwhelming. So what we want to do is break it up into smaller chunks, into multiple guidelines, And we really wanted to make sure that we put in the focus. Deborah touched on this earlier about balancing user privacy against the operational needs of the library. So, you know, on one extreme would be like absolute privacy, where you know, everything about the patron is almost unknown, and then the other extreme is you could know everything about the user. And what we want to do is acknowledge that that's a continuum that users find themselves, both library users and just online web users in general. And we need to understand that we want to put the user in the position to make decisions as much as possible about how much privacy they're willing to give up for convenience or for a modern web experience or for some other thing that they want. And to really put the user in the position to make that decision. Next slide. You'll see a screenshot here as an example of the privacy guidelines for ebook lending and digital content vendors. And this is the first guideline we wrote, and we wrote it actually in response to that Adobe incident that Deborah talked about earlier in her presentation. We also wrote, these are the other ones we had them in, library management systems or integrated library systems, guidelines on websites, OPACs, and discovery services, public access computers and networks, and data exchange between network devices and services, which is really kind of a complicated way to cover multiple things like self-checkout terminals and API access to your library system and various other ways that data can be shared kind of automatically between library servers and devices and services. And then the last one is focusing on students in K through 12 schools. We also, next slide, please. There's also one other guideline that's listed up on that page that is a little bit broader than just privacy, but it does have privacy aspects. Last year, the Intellectual Freedom Committee approved guidelines around content filtering. So it's an acknowledgement that many libraries, for various reasons, might find the need to provide content filters in their libraries and operate content filters in their libraries, usually around E-rate and SEPA compliance, but also for other reasons. And these guidelines are the official guideline title is Guidelines to Minimize the Negative Effects of Internet Content Filters on Intellectual Freedom. I refer to it informally as how to make filters less sucky. And so we tried to provide some practical advice in there, but there is a section in there around the privacy concerns around content filters, and also around SSL decryption, which is that content filters can potentially compromise the privacy of people using HTTPS web pages. So I just want to let you know that that resource is available there. Next slide, please. So I helped write that first guideline we talked about, the ebooks and digital content providers, and I was really excited about it. And I shared it with people my colleagues up in Alaska here. And I had a colleague who's a collection development librarian, and she said, "Well, that's great, but you know, this is all great advice, but how do we do this?" And so immediately realized that even though we've taken this big kind of document at a 50,000 foot level and we brought it down to 10,000 foot level, we still need to get kind of even closer to actually how do you do this? How do you make this happen? So the Intellectual Freedom Committee teamed up with LITA, the Library Information Technology Association, inside of ALA. Volunteers from both groups worked on a set of checklists for each guideline. And it's really focusing on actions that libraries can take. And we organized the actions into 3 priority groups. The first group is hopefully actions that any library can take regardless of their capacity, regardless of hopefully how much control they have over their technology or how nimble their organization is about responding to change or making changes, that these are things that are under the library's control. And then 2 and 3 can be a bit more difficult actions to take because they involve perhaps working with vendors or working with school administrations or your governing body or whatever in order to put more privacy protections in place. So the next sections we go to, we're going to actually look at 2 of these checklists in detail. We're going to look at the one for digital content providers that we can see a screenshot of on this page, and we're going to look at the one for integrated library systems and walk through them. I don't think we have time to go through all of them, so we just picked those as a sample to go through. And next slide. And so at this point, I just want to break and see if there's any questions about what I've covered so far or things that people want to make sure that I cover.
Hi, Mike. There's no questions just yet. So a reminder to everyone out there to type those into your questions box, and we'll get to them at the next break.
And especially, I might go over some technical terms, or I might use anything that you want clarification on. Just put it in there, and we'll try to wrap it up. So, okay. And address it. Okay, so content providers, and Deborah touched on this in one of her slides before. It used to be a much simpler world that libraries lived in, where we kind of controlled the card catalog and we controlled the checkout records of our users, and we kind of knew where that data was, and we knew the extent of the information we collected about them. But at this point, libraries with ebooks and other online resources, we've really introduced a lot of information, provided information to our patrons that we don't necessarily know where some of the information flows are. So the individual has this screenshot when we were working with LIDA volunteers, the technology volunteers. We were trying to draw up a flow chart of kind of where all the data was, and it got very complicated very quickly. But one of the people drew this up on I don't know if it was a napkin, but they drew it up and they scanned it to me and they let me use it. Amy Farquhar drew this up, and I just think it kind of gives a hint of what we're getting at, is that as libraries, we're providing subscription access to these content service providers, but we're not quite clear how much they're talking to each other and what third parties they're using when they provide their services. So nowadays, when you build an online product, you might easily use a lot of resources that aren't in your data center in order to provide that service. And so this is where I think a lot of our concern around privacy, we talk about government surveillance, but I think a lot of our concern here is around commercial surveillance. So what extent is what our patrons reading being looked at, being monitored, usually to provide better services, or a better product, or types of personalization and convenience. But we want to make sure that users understand when someone is observing their reading behavior, and give them options about, do they want to participate in that. Next slide, please. So if you go to the Choose Privacy website and pull up the checklist for content providers, here's the set of priorities on the checklist in priority 1, the actions. And the library should link to vendor privacy policies. So the recommendation here is that many of our vendors have privacy policies about using it, but they might not be in a convenient place that our users can find them. At the point that they click on a book title or they go into a particular resource, they're usually just trying to get there, and all the interfaces are a little bit different. So what we're suggesting is that somewhere on the library website, you provide a document that links to all the privacy policies of the different vendors that you use for digital content. The other thing is to work with, check with all your providers and make sure that the default configuration of the services that they provide use the opt-in method where possible. So sometimes providers provide their service with all the bells and whistles turned on, and then the patron has to opt out of those bells and whistles. And what we're suggesting is, where possible, that you configure them so the patron has to opt in order to get those bells and whistles. They have to take an active step and provide their consent in order to collect that information if they want to participate in that service. And then the fourth tip is that library staff should become knowledgeable in helping patrons manage their privacy settings inside any of the services these content providers provide. So this is more of a digital literacy to make sure we understand how the products work and what the privacy settings are, so we can then advise our patrons on how they can make changes if they want to those settings. And then the fourth one is to have a procedure in place that if the content provider that you're using has a data breach and they should inform the library if there's a data breach, and the library should have a way to inform patrons that are affected by the data breach about that data breach. So that's priority one. Those are actions we think that are pretty much in control of a library. Not that it isn't a lot of work, but they are not a lot of external dependencies for the library in order to do this. These are things that are kind of under the library's control. Next slide. So this is priority two. This gets a little bit harder. And what we want to do here is add privacy considerations to your collection development policy, to your selection criteria. So when you are considering adopting a new resource, make it a criteria, something that you grade when you're choosing whether to choose this product or not. Does the provider publish a privacy policy? Does it support the opt-in method for providing additional services? Can users access and review the personal data that vendor collects about them? And is the vendor using HTTPS encryption for data communication? So is their website or service running HTTPS? The second set is around license agreements with new providers. At this point, we understand, your existing agreements are whatever they are, but when you get a new content provider, the license agreements should be reviewed to make sure they conform with state confidentiality laws and library privacy policies. They should also have somewhere stipulate that the library retains ownership of user data. And there should be a way, it should include protocol or procedures for how law enforcement requests are handled, and also that protocol for the notification of data breaches. Okay, and so this gets a little bit harder. This is about trying to create a more privacy-aware situation, a better situation for protecting privacy protections with new agreements that you have with new products you're buying. Next slide. Thank you. So the third set of actions are priority three, and basically take some of the things we talked about on the previous in priority two and review your existing license agreements. See if you can change the agreements to include some of the concerns that we talked about on the previous slide. and consider not renewing the agreements if the vendor can't address the concerns. The other one is to review the vendor's data governance plan. This means basically, data governance plan means how does the vendor handle data, specifically user data or patron data, in their services and in their data center and their products. It has things like data security, data backup, breach, how do you deal with breaches, how you deal with law enforcement effects, what's the life cycle of the data. Anyway, so vendors should have some sort of policy about that or a plan about that, how they handle that. And then if they don't, you should ask them to create one. And then the vendors should be conducting privacy audits, which are kind of like security audits of a data center, but they're a little more focused on the privacy aspects. And if your vendors, hopefully your vendor's doing one. If so, they share the results with you. If not, ask them to do one, to commit to doing one at some point in the future, and then share those results with you in the library. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so that was a checklist. And that was the idea of giving kind of very practical steps libraries could take. Are there any questions about that checklist before we move on to the integrated library systems checklist?
Hi, yes, we did get a couple of questions during your last section. So can you further explain the significance of giving an opt-in versus an opt-out? Do you have any examples or other concerns about it?
Yeah, yes. So the reason we want opt-in is the idea is that with opt-out, the problem is that the patron's been signed up for all sorts of stuff, and if they've never necessarily, all they've done is made a decision to use that service, but they might not be aware of components of that service they've signed up for. So the opt-in model basically says that I actually use the integrated library system as an example. We'll talk about it later, so I'll cover a little ground there. Many integrated library systems have the ability that you can save the checkout history of the patron. That when the user logs in through the library catalog to their own account to renew books or whatever, they can also see a list of what they've checked out in the past. And if your vendor provides that ability in their system, we're suggesting that you don't automatically turn everyone on so that they have that history turned on and they have to actively turn it off, have to opt out of that. What we're suggesting is that your patrons are not automatically have that turned on, but that they see it as an option that they can opt into if they like to have their checkout history tracked so they can see what they read in the past. So we think that as many features as possible that the other content providers are providing should follow that model of opt-in. It also follows the fair information practices that Deborah mentioned before, and there's some law around that and around about the idea about that's the best way to allow people as much. So instead of us making the decision for them, the patron or the user is going to make the decision.
Okay. What other questions here? What about warning patrons about things like library ELF or commenting on books or, oh, sorry, it moved, you know, any library websites or things like that?
Yeah, there is a whole, there's a whole set of, one of the other guidelines, and just for the effort of time, I didn't get to that. Check out the guideline on library websites, library catalogs and discovery services. It's really about the main interface that the libraries control to their content, which is the library catalog or the discovery layer. If you're in an academic setting, you have more resources. And it talks about being careful not only about what what sort of social media integration you have into those websites, but also providing users with heads up about that. So, you know, the Amazon book covers is a good example. If you put Amazon book covers in your library catalog, then the types of searches and the types of items that your patron clicks on inside your catalog is communicated to Amazon. So that's an example of one the library has to make the decision for the user. But the one where you're providing the ability to rate or comment on, the library should develop some sort of policy or informational piece so that the users understand that you know, it seems self-aware if you write a review about a book, you're revealing your reading history somewhat. You're sharing that with the public. But the libraries need to understand things like, are you going to allow anonymous comments in your catalog or not? Or are you going to have to tie to some sort of user identity? And then things like that. So there is advice in there about libraries creating a social media policy or a policy around social media use as it integrates with library websites.
Okay. Two more questions. Do you know if any ILS hosted servers, or sorry, ILS hosted services actually allow you to limit their use of data?
So I guess I would say in general, I think a lot of the integrated library system vendors are probably doing a pretty good job of keeping that data in-house for their own use. That's just my gut reaction, but I don't know that for a fact. I was involved in the NISO consensus framework where we had digital content providers and we had integrated library system providers, and it seems that the vendors that specifically work with the libraries as their major customers, for the most part, they're willing to adopt and build the products we want. If we emphasize privacy is important to us, they will try to make sure that they provide the products that provide that. One of the things people have asked for is a scorecards on different content providers and integrated library system vendors about how well they do with different aspects of privacy. So I think that would be an interesting resource if we can get that, so that people making purchasing decisions could look at a scorecard and see, oh, okay, they provide, here's how they stand on privacy. But I don't have a way to make that recommendation right now.
Okay. All right. Well, I think that's it for now. I know you still have a lot of content to get through. So.
All right. I'll try to move a little faster. I was like, oh, we have 90 minutes. I don't have to rush. But I think we do now. So, okay, next question. So, next slide. So this is about ILS checklist, and the ILS itself has become more complicated. That's what this screenshot's trying to show. It's not simply just the catalog, it's the inventory system itself anymore. It talks to many different parts. Next slide. And this is the checklist on the integrated library system. And here's the first set of actions: is develop a privacy policy and publish it on the website. So specific to the ILS, what are you doing with the data, and why are you collecting it? Only collect and store patron information needed for library operations. And then when you create reports, try to aggregate anonymized reports to remove personally identifiable information, so that when you share reports internally, or especially if you make them public, that there isn't a way to see personal data in those reports. The next one is, we talked about this a little bit, configure the ILS to remove transactional data by default when an item is returned. And this is how a lot of ILSs work by default, and then allow patrons to opt into that checkout history if available. And then have a set of library procedures around handling government and law enforcement requests for patron information. Okay, next slide. So this is priority 2, restrict access to patron records to staff members with a demonstrated need. So a volunteer shelving books probably doesn't need an account that allows them to see the checkout history of every patron in the system. So create accounts for at the appropriate level for each staff member to avoid exposing that information. Configure library notices to send out minimal personal information. So you don't necessarily need to send out the full, you want to kind of minimize the amount of information that's being sent out. Emails are unencrypted and you're not sure who's going to receive them. Printed notices on postcards have a similar problem. So just avoid broadcasting out more information than you need on the notices. Develop some procedures around the extraction and sharing of patron data, both inside the library and maybe to third parties like collection development agencies or other entities. You need to have some guidelines in place about when you do it, how much information, what sorts of controls are on it, and make sure that there's a way to have that information is disposed or deleted, it just doesn't sit around forever. Have a procedure for encrypting your offline data backups, or so your tapes, or if they're sitting on disk or cloud storage somewhere, that those backups are encrypted, because there's a lot of information in there, and if someone gains access to those, if it's encrypted, that's another level of protection. And then keep your ILS application server software up to date and patched. The next slide. Here's a third priority, and these are things that maybe you don't have any control over, but passwords should be stored in a secure fashion using proper cryptology inside your system. And an example in our ILS that I want to get changed is right now a staff member can view someone's PIN and tell them what it is, and that's a problem. They shouldn't be able to do that. They should have a way to reset the PIN for someone, and the person should have a way to reset the PIN themselves, but we shouldn't be able to see the person's PIN or password. They might be using it for other services like their ATM, and we shouldn't have a way of knowing what that is. Encrypt all traffic between the ILS server and any client connection outside of secure LAN. So this is something our consortium needs to work on. We have staff client applications. We're in a broad consortium that uses the internet for traffic, and those individual connections are in the clear. And so we need to move to where those are encrypted and protected, either built into the client if that's available from the vendor, or using something like a VPN tunnel. And then conduct security audits of your ILS server and network to make sure it's as secure as possible. And once again, create procedures to handle data breaches and mitigate their impact on patrons. Next slide. So I went through that a little fast. Are there any questions about that area?
No questions yet.
Okay. So we'll move on to the next. So those were examples of 2 checklists, and there's 6 checklists altogether, and guidelines and checklists, and you can go look at the other 4. We're going to switch now. We're going to look at a particular technology, HTTPS, and a tool called Let's Encrypt that allows users to get free HTTPS certificates. Okay, next slide. So the problem with why HTTPS, the problem is that HTTP, when you read a website that's HTTP, all the content of that website is transmitted in the clear and allows anyone in that chain to potentially eavesdrop on it. It could be someone else on the network. It could be on Wi-Fi, it could be somewhere, there's multiple routes that those packets take. And basically, anyone else on the network that turns on a packet sniffer can read and see what's being transmitted, what's being read in the clear. HTTPS creates an encrypted tunnel that protects that from being eavesdropped. So it helps protect reader privacy. Now, of course, it doesn't say anything about what's done on the web server that's serving the content, how they're handling the data. We're just talking about encrypting the transaction in between so there's no unauthorized people looking in on that communication. Next slide. There's a big movement to encrypt the web, and here's some of the people who've been involved in it. I'll just focus on the last bullet point. There was a library digital privacy pledge that came out last year, 2016, that encouraged libraries and content providers to adopt HTTPS, and there is some movement being made. Next slide. Part of that movement to encrypt the entire web, so it's not just libraries saying we need to do it, it's everyone, but part of that movement is a project called Let's Encrypt. It's a certificate authority that issues certificates. The certificates are free, and it provides a tool for easy installation and renewal. And this means that there's really no excuse to not be trying to move your library websites to HTTPS, and or library vendors not providing HTTPS built into their products. Next. Let's Encrypt is sponsored by a lot of big players, Mozilla, Cisco, Electronic Frontier Foundation, and if you look down there, ALA is a paid sponsoring member of Let's Encrypt. So this is great, providing a tool we can all use to move to HTTPS. Next slide. Adoption's been very rapid. It's only been out for a year and a half. It's already issued 28 million certificates. It's one of the largest certificate authorities around now. And by some estimates, 50% of the web is now encrypted. Next. So Let's Encrypt provides a number of tools. There's a CertBot client that can run on any modern kind of web server, and it's very easy to use. It takes about 5 minutes to install certificates using that. And I provided, there's a number of, on the Choose Privacy Week website under resources, on the Let's Encrypt page, there's a number of recipes on how to do this. So we have them for Apache server, an ISS web server, an Easy Proxy server, a library OPAC server, and an API Tomcat server for an integrated library system. So those are example recipes you can use to walk you through how to do it. Next slide. And are there any questions about why we want to use HTTPS or anything around that?
Okay, I haven't seen any questions come in yet, so just a shout out to all the shout out to all the attendees. This is your chance, so we'll be wrapping up soon. So please send in your questions so we can address them at the end.
Okay, so this section we're going to go on to. We're going to talk about some tools you can use to protect user privacy. So this is when people are using web browsers, either on their own or in your library. Some of the things you can do to protect their privacy when they surf the web. You can see there's a page up on the Choose Privacy website under the resources section. There's the URL for it there. Next slide. So we're going to talk about the threats to privacy, browser best practices, in other words, things you can do about how you use your browsers to protect your privacy, specific browser extensions like HTTPS everywhere that Deborah mentioned, VPNs or virtual private networks, and the Tor browser. So that's what we're going to hope to cover here. Next slide. So there's a couple different types of threats. I've broken them into 3 broad categories. There's websites. So when you're on a web browser and you access a website, what is it doing? What types of information is it gathering? And is it sharing that information with others? So activity tracking, fingerprinting, and cross-site scripting are all ways that websites can kind of compromise your privacy by sharing that information with other websites and other third parties. Network monitoring is another major way that privacy can be threatened. If you at work, school, or your internet service provider, they may be logging all your activity that you do, and they have the ability to monitor that. And then open Wi-Fi networks, what the concern is there is that someone else using the Wi-Fi network has turned on monitoring tools and is looking at what other people on that network are accessing. Next slide. So here's a set of browser best practices. So this is kind of the first step is use a current browser. Don't use a modern current browser. Almost all modern browsers have a privacy mode. If you use that, it will help protect your privacy. You can also frequently delete your cache and cookies. You can even set your browser up to do that every single time you exit the browser. Another thing you can do is that Google and Bing actually gather a lot of information about your browsing behavior based on the search engines use. And you can use some other alternative search engines like DuckDuckGo and StartPage that provide some anonymity when you search the web using their indexes. I advocate using multiple browsers. So I use, for example, I use Chrome to access Google products and to access Google Docs and Gmail. And I just stayed logged in on that one. I use that when I'm logged in. I use Firefox for more anonymous browsing, and I have it set to dump the cookies and delete my cache whenever I exit it. And then I use another browser for my banking and financial information, and I don't use it for anything else. So next slide. So here's some extensions you can install or plugins you can install on most of these are available on Firefox and Chrome, and some of them may be available on IE and or Safari. Deborah mentioned HTTPS everywhere, and basically some websites that are not using HTTPS by default have it available. If you bother to type in HTTPS and then the web address, it would actually use that, but if you just went to it automatically, it wouldn't. This plugin actually forces the browser to talk with it to HTTPS when available. Privacy, there's a number of privacy extensions that I could list here, and there's a few more listed on the Choose Privacy Week website page, but I just decided to highlight two of them. Privacy Badger is by the EFF people, and it blocks spy ads and invisible trackers. And then Disconnect and Ghostery are two separate plugins that allow you to kind of see the tracking that's taking place in your browser and block particular ones. Next page. So those plugins work better at protecting you from the websites, but doesn't protect you from network monitoring. To protect you from your work, ISP, or school monitoring what you do, or someone else on an open Wi-Fi, you need to either do VPN or Tor, and I'm going to try to contrast those two. So a VPN is a private virtual network. There are some free ones. It basically creates an encrypted tunnel between your browser and another server out on the web, and then it goes through your ISP or through your work or through your school network, and all your traffic is encrypted from your desktop to this external server that's outside that network monitoring. And then from that server, you go out and surf the web. Next slide. It protects from that monitoring. It provides some browser anonymity, and it covers other things, not just browsers. It also protects mail clients and other applications. Not all VPNs are created equal, so be selective. and do your research on buying one. And lots of people use VPN for a lot of different reasons. It's a pretty common technology nowadays. Next. The other route to go is Tor. The Tor browser provides an anonymous, it's a browser that's wrapped up in an anonymity network. Next. Sorry, I'm running out of time here. It creates a relay. It provides more anonymity. I'm just going to go through these so I have a little bit of time for questions. Next. You can see the rest of this. It has some usability issues. It's a little bit slower. Next. We're going to skip tails. Next. Here are some resources on public computing, the Library Freedom Project, which covers a lot on Tor. And Deborah mentioned before the San Jose Public Library Virtual Privacy Lab. And next. We wanted to put in one more shout out to non-online privacy
Yes.
around privacy screens. And go ahead, Deborah.
Yeah, just that not all display of a patron's data is digital, and we have to remember to be thoughtful about displays on things like self-checkout stations and public library systems. So privacy screens, use of study carrels, thoughtful arrangement of furniture and other equipment is really necessary. We also have to think about self-serve hold systems that display full names in the books. This is just a bad thing to do, and it's not hard to configure an ILS to anonymize a person's name and share that with the user so they can pick up the book without disclosing what a person is reading. And finally, reference desks, just thoughtful arrangement of reference desks so that when a person asks a question, they're not sharing it with the entire library. And that generally just wraps up our thoughts on non-digital privacy today.
So we went over a lot. Are there any questions? I'm sorry I rushed it at the end. I didn't manage my time well.
Well, thank you, Michael and Deborah. That was really, really helpful. I did have one question come in about the privacy screens. Do you know where people can purchase those?
3M has some.
Yeah, and as I'm an ALA staff person, Mike is the person who's out in the library world. So, but I assume many library vendors who provide workstation equipment and accessories would have them available.
One of the things is to provide an ability for patrons to either lift the privacy screen or put it back down. You might also want to consider them for staff interactions with patrons. The other way to do it also is to allow people to check out laptops so they can go sit in a fashion in a place that other people can't see what they're doing, because some people don't like the privacy screens.
All right, well, I don't see any other questions coming in. I am seeing a bunch of comments from people saying thank you, and this was a great webinar and good resources. Good. So you really gave us a lot of things to think about today, and you know, both, like I said, for Deborah and Michael, you both presented different perspectives on library privacy, and this was really helpful, I think. So thank you both for your time today. Any last comments before we wrap up?
No, just that anyone is welcome to get in touch if they have additional questions about the content of the webinar. We'll be happy to provide information and resources. Our emails are right there on the screen. Thank you.
Yep, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
Yep.
Yeah, it's terrific. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap up the webinar. We did record today. Thank you to Deborah and Michael for allowing us to do that. So I will be posting the recording and the slides very soon on the Rails website, and I'll share that with everyone. So thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Louise.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.